And so I'm very privileged today to be speaking with Doug Wilson.
Hey.
In this video, we're going to be reacting to the Nick Freitas Doug Wilson interview. I think this is super important. Some things I like, there's some things I don't. Let's talk about it. Let's go. If I ever have the privilege of being on Nick Freitas' podcast, I'm wearing flip-flops so that I can have free toes.
That's all you ever wear is flip-flops.
I don't wear flip-flops to church.
You probably have your flip-flops on inside your shoes.
Again, even people that I liked and respected, saying that you and this concept of Christian nationalism was this very, very scary thing. Mm-hmm. But I was also seeing people like John Piper saying, no, I like the way this guy preaches.
Dadgummit, Piper!
Can you give us kind of like a baseline of what do you mean when you talk about this idea of Christian nationalism?
Sure.
I like Nick. He seems like a nice guy. I don't watch his stuff a whole lot, and I'm at a point where I'm just like, I really just want to know what our best options are at this point, all right? So there are some figures that already have such large platforms, and so out of the ones that are available, what can we work with? But as I've said many times, and in the case of someone like Nick, who has actually a political background, he's not a theologian, and so I'll just say again, there are niche theological conversations underneath the hood that Nick may not be aware of. And so, for example, federal vision, which I'm not going to get into defining and critiquing federal vision in this video, but this is not the first time I've said this, that Doug Wilson has a reputation of saying, I'm not a federal visionist, and then proceeds to define something that sounds very, very similar to federal vision. And so when at the start of the conversation, you say, well, there are a lot of people that don't really want me to interview you. Don't interview him and don't interview him. And then he says, well, I'm just going to let Doug speak for himself. But that's part of the problem, is that at least in the theological conversations that we've been trying to have with Doug for a very long time, Doug Wilson has proven that you can't always trust that when he says, oh, well, this is not the kind of Christian nationalist that I am. This is the kind of Christian nationalist that I am. That he's telling the truth. He may or may not be, but it's harder to believe him when he defines Christian nationalism a certain way because of the ways in which in other conversations he said, well, I'm not this, but then he defines it and he just sounds too slippery in his definitions. Like the theonomy issue.
And look, for anybody that's immediately thinking in the head, oh, so you want the old Levitical law? Christians don't believe we are bound to Levitical law, right? There's still the moral law through the...
Exactly. You can prohibit abortion without prohibiting clam chowder.
Yeah, exactly. Without prohibiting bacon.
Right, we're not prohibiting bacon.
What Nick may not be aware of, Doug makes a distinction between a twofold division of the law, but not a threefold division of the law. So what they're doing right now is advocating for the abrogation of the ceremonial law, which includes don't eat bacon. But what Doug doesn't specify is that he's the theonomist, and that in theonomy, even though later he is going to limit the state's ability to police idolatry, which I agree with Doug on, he is not going to be open with Nick on this interview about the fact that he is a theonomist with 1,000 caveats that make him very, very slippery. Nick may not be, probably is not aware of these niche theological conversations about theonomy and whether or not you're a threefold division or a twofold division of the law kind of guy, or what divisions or dimensions of the law have been abrogated. So yes, we don't believe that you can't mix threads in your clothing because the Levitical ceremonial laws have passed away. But what do you think about the judicial laws? Nick's not going to even ask him that question. Does he even know how to ask that question? And so this is me yet again saying people don't realize, Nick may not realize, these niche theological conversations going on under the hood, which have generational impacts, right? So Doug can get on a podcast and say a couple of really nice sounding things and it get tons of views, and Doug seems very reasonable. But what's not being addressed, what's not being talked about, discussed, or debated is the fact that Doug is a theonomist.
The laws are by definition an imposition of morality. And it's the only question is not whether but which. It's not whether we impose morality, it's which morality we impose. Because
It's not whether but which. It's whether the civil magistrate is competent, authorized, able to impose the first table of the law. That's specifically the niche theological question that is in question here.
This is why the American Constitution was a work of theological genius. Not just political insight, but theological genius. If I were a Martian that came down and got a copy of the Constitution and went back to Mars to study it, I would say, and I studied it for a couple of years, and another Martian said, what's the central underlying presupposition of the American Constitution? And I'd say, well, it appears to me to be resting on the bedrock of the doctrine of total depravity. Okay.
It's very reformed.
Very reformed, and I think it was because the American Constitution.
Again, let's just step back and try to accept W's where we can. So yes, there are things that I very much dislike about Doug Wilson being platformed by Nick Freitas. But what Doug just said there is rock rib reformed. I mean, it's just thoroughbred reformed, especially when it comes to the Reformed and Baptist and evangelical influence on American politics. Our form of government must include checks and balances based off of the assumption that we are totally depraved sinners. And so you're talking about totally depraved sinners governing totally depraved sinners because those sinners need to be governed, and yet the structure of the government needs to be such that it assumes that men are at least, the secularist would agree, fallible, not infallible, and the Christian, and especially the Calvinist, would say not just fallible, fallen. And so on that assumption, and because of how that fallen and fallible nature becomes corrupted by power, we need a system of checks and balances. And I agree with Doug. I like that he said that the Constitution is a work of theological genius.
Guys, got hair loss? I
No,
know what
come
you're
on.
thinking. Should I shave my head? This isn't 1970. Keep your hair and your...
You made a distinction once that I really appreciated when you made the distinction between race and culture. If I go to a black person in Los Angeles, and then I go to another one in Detroit, and then I go to another one in Mobile, and then I go to another one in Paris, and then I go to another one in Lesotho, and then I go to another one in Lebanon, am I going to get the same exact answer based off of the melanin levels in their skin?
Brian Sauvé would like a word.
Because that sounds kind of racist to me. That you would presume.
So Nick is gonna say, like, hey, it's pretty racist. This was our critique of the social justice movement as conservatives. It's pretty racist to speak the way you're speaking about both blacks and whites. It's racist to both. And so I don't know if Nick knows who Brian Sauvé is. I wouldn't be surprised if he does or doesn't. But Brian Sauvé is acting like a leftist.
Thomas Sowell, in a marvelous essay called Black Rednecks and White Liberals.
Very interesting book.
Very interesting book. Argued that basically black culture, what we call black ghetto culture, is a variant of cracker culture, which came from the north of Britain,
Scots-Irish,
the Scots-Irish, and what are the values for males? Well, drinking and fighting. But that was people who know something about history know that it's not as tidy as our current prejudices want it to be.
Again, you have similarly Doug saying here something that makes sense and is a W, and I think is good for conversation. It's good for Nick. It's good for these ideas to be platformed. But what is hitched to those ideas is the question. It just reminds me a little bit, but there were some people in the recent Nick Fuentes Tucker Carlson interview I wish I could have reacted to, where people are bringing up things that Nick has said in the past. And in the Tucker Carlson interview, the issue is, okay, Nick, do you want us to pretend like you never said any of the other things that you have said? It seems like you're pretending like, oh, I've always been this reasonable as I'm coming off to you now. I am just saying what I've always said. I'm a nice guy. And something that I've tried to explain on the channel a little bit is that a lot of the people on the new right that Doug is about to be very critical of, they actually took their cues from Doug Wilson and applied his logic in more extreme ways. So, for example, Serrated Edge. Well, they didn't have to hold their speech morally accountable, so why would they have to hold even more extreme speech or their actions morally accountable? Why wouldn't the means justify the ends in a more extreme sense if you told them at the outset that the means justify the ends, but just a little bit, but in a way that's like, well, I'm not going to tell you where the line is, but I'll tell you when you cross it. So then Doug started being critical of these young men who had learned from Doug that, hey, as long as we're achieving some sort of political stability in the name of Jesus, then it's okay if we're not being morally regulated by Scripture and God's moral law.
So the late Andrew Breitbart said that politics is downstream from culture. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that's very true, but culture is downstream from worship.
I hate how much I agree with that. That is such a good way of putting it. Oh my gosh. I need to think about it more, but
Meet Gym Monster 2, your all-in-one smart home gym.
what in the world? What is going on? I'm in shock. I work out every day.
There is this important distinction that has to be made, because I've heard some people who are professing Christ, and then they will say other things of like, those two things do not coincide. Mm-hmm. And I know which ones you're more loyal to, because you get mad at me for pointing out the scriptural inconsistency with what you're saying.
There's a doctrine floating around on the right of no enemies to the right, or no enemies on the right.
Yeah.
And if I declare beforehand, I will have no enemies on the right,
yeah,
all I'm doing is telling the devil to attack me from the right.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I'm just saying, I'm going to leave this flank undefended.
Somebody asked you once, like, what you thought of that. I remember your response was, does God have enemies on the right?
So let's just be able to step back and say, I am so grateful for the good things that were promoted. I'm not necessarily grateful that Doug Wilson's platform was promoted, but I'm grateful that the ideas got out there, and what we can do, what we must do, is just pray that the right ideas said in the right way, even if drawn by a crooked stick, there was a straight line, and maybe someone can hear this and be persuaded away from radical ideology that's going to capture the hearts and souls of young men. Now, the issue with Doug Wilson, and I think it's a bigger issue that needs to be parsed out more, is the ways in which Doug's theology is driving his political endeavors. And so we don't impose, as part of our values evangelical system, our theological distinctives as part of that system. We don't impose those theological distinctives on others, nor do we allow the theological distinctives that drive the values of others from other religious traditions to drive us. Are able to separate the theological distinctives from the values, not in our own system, but in our political endeavors, and say, oh, these are my values and these are your values, and I'm able to partner with you. This is actually a very moderate conservative position. There are more extreme conservative positions that say, no, only my system and its theological motivations can drive the values in my evangelicalism. And it seems like here, Doug, on the face of it, seems to be articulating something closer to a values evangelical kind of system. The issue is his system going to allow him to do that? Take Islam, for example. It becomes harder in other religious traditions to actually separate the theological distinctives from the values that result from it. This becomes kind of clear when you consider the relation and the similarity, I should say, between Doug Wilson and Richard Baxter. Now, consider Richard Baxter's view of mission. His view of missions, or evangelism, was the Christianization of the peoples or the savages. And so when you bring the gospel to a place, You not only bring the gospel, but you also bring the trends and traditions and culture with that gospel. And so essentially, you turn the savage into a white man, a white Christian. With Doug, he brings arguably not even the gospel, but he brings some kind of gospel, a federal vision gospel, and with it, and I would say kind of inseparably part of it, he brings a Christianization type of mission. That the proclamation of the gospel cannot just be the as he calls it, the white hot gospel, but it also requires certain level of Christian publication, a publishing house, and a Christian culture that comes with it, very similar to the Baxterian conception of mission that we saw in the 17th century. I will continue to recommend this article by Tom Hicks and Garrett Walden on the similarity between Doug and Baxter theologically. And I would actually say that I think there also is a similarity. I know Kevin DeYoung talked about the Moscow Mood. The Moscow Mood is Baxterian Christianization as mission. I'm going to think out loud for a second and say it seems to me that Doug's view of the gospel and Doug's view of mission also is connected as well. This is a less than distinctively Reformed and Protestant evangelical conception of what mission is, and it certainly ain't Baptist. Yes, Doug is saying some W's. Really appreciate the W's. I appreciate the platforming of some good ideas. The issue, the niche theological conversations going on underneath the hood that Nick and most that are listening to Nick's podcast may not be aware of are all of the bad ideas that are connected to Doug Wilson's theology. So, go read Tom Hicks' article on the Moscow Doctrine. Celebrate W's where you can. I'm grateful that it was Doug Wilson being interviewed and not Joel Webbin, not Nick Fuentes. Stay evangelical in your political theology, your political engagements, and also in your conception of the gospel. And stay Baptist, my friends. This is hilarious. Baby, this is so funny.